your struggle has literally, this is not a rhetorical exaggeration, world historical importance, because it serves a lesson also to us in the so-called developed West. We have our own feminism. In its predominant form, it is the so-called politically correct Me Too feminism, where it is clear that it mostly attracts and mobilizes middle class, upper middle class women. It solicits them to assert their specific identity, mostly excluding, opposing men, while your struggle in Iran is precisely a feminist protest which immediately includes also men. Men know well that the oppression of women in Iran also involves their own oppression, that Iranian men will not be really free without the full freedom of women. We, mostly in the West, men in the West, we don't know this. Second thing, the victim was a Kurdish young woman. But again, it's not that now Kurds want identity, their specific way of life. No, it became clear to Iranians that the oppression of Kurds is just a moment of the general political oppression in Iran.
Hey folks, yes, it was Slavo's usual form. I'm at with me as always, David Griscom. Hello, Dave.
Hey brother, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. It's good to know that we're on the same page as Slavo there with our analysis.
Very nice. And we're gonna. There's be more on that this weekend for patrons. You get access to that patreon.com/leftreckoning. We're gonna have our friend and comrade Jean Bajelon on the program to talk a little bit more about the Kurdish aspect to these protests, and also everything is not a fucking color revolution. I'm very excited to have Jean on to break down some of these more obnoxious tendencies, I think, that we've seen on the American left. And if you want a more in-depth conversation too, and you missed it last week, we had Asal Rod of the National Iranian American Council on the program last week as well. You can find that all up on our YouTube channel. But of course, we're still standing in solidarity with all the Iranians who are continuing to push back and fight for basic human rights, man. It's been some really inspiring stuff.
Yeah, it has. Absolutely. Now, also, we got a lot on our plate today. We are going to be talking to Brian Mier of Telesur and BrasilWire about the election in Brazil. I think he has a little bit more of a optimistic take than I think some of the prevailing narrative would have. But we get into, what is actually concerning. And David, do you want to preview what else we have today?
Yeah, really, we get this question a lot from people. They want to know about what relationship NGOs and the left should have. We had Ben Fong and Melissa Naschek on the program, who wrote an excellent article in Catalyst. So that's going to be coming up later in the program. I mean, it's a very, very well-grounded, very material analysis of NGOs in the United States, and I think brings up some really important strategic questions. So really looking forward to sharing that conversation with all of y'all as well.
Now, something also exciting happened. Was it today or yesterday? David is once again in Jacobin magazine, this time with an article titled "When Texas Cowboys Fought Private Property." That with a nice little representation of life in a cow camp. there. Before I let you talk about this, David, I want to read a passage from one of my favorite novels. This is by The Badlands by Oakley Hall, one of the great novelists. A famous novel by Oakley Hall is Warlock, which was made into like a Western back in the 60s. But he's got this passage here. This is about the Dakota Territories. And is so there's a Scottish sort of magnet beef baron character who's based on actually a French guy named the Marquis de Moore, who tried to set up a big ranching refrigeration business and was one of the first people to set up barbed wire in the Dakota Territories. And here's a section here where one of a smaller free rancher comes across his barbed wire for the first time. Though he had known he must encounter McCrae's fence, it was a shock when he came upon it. 3 strands of glinting, twisted wire zigzagging from tree to tree on the north slope of a broad swale. Farther along, posts had been set. He rode along the wire, noticing where it had been cut and patched. He felt a prickling at the back of his neck and glanced up to see a horseman watching him from the top of the butte. It seemed important that he ignored the guard as he rode on east toward the dull gleam of the river. His anger seemed to him disproportionate and was physical, like a cold in his head. He realized that this was what Hardy and Driggs had been trying to express. He had been unable to understand why the Scot was so hated, but the fence and its guard violated some deeply held and sacred sentiment of which he had not even been aware until he had encountered McCrae's wire in its arrogance. And so you have basically the real world version of this that happened in Texas. You've talked a little bit about it on Left Reckoning, but we're going back, latter half of the 19th century here, latter part of it. Introduce us to some of the cast of characters here.
Yeah, I mean, like most places, barbed wire, came to Texas. Actually, it was first promoted at large scale in San Antonio, and the first iterations of barbed wire were extremely cruel. The barbs were really long. They were extremely painful to walk into as a person, but also extremely dangerous for cattle. And it was one of those inventions that fundamentally shaped the West. There's a great history of barbed wire, both in the American West, but also its usage later in World War II in concentration camps, called the Devil's Wire or the Devil's Rope, which people should check out if they're interested in like a longer social history of it. But yeah, I mean, effectively, to give people the setting, like after the Civil War, Texas, like the rest of the South, was in a huge economic crisis, and you had a lot of Northern capital and European capital coming in and flooding up and buying up a bunch of the best grazing land because there was a lot of speculation in the cattle industry. And what ended up happening was a lot of these kind of newer ranchers and also some of the more established like landowners in Texas started up fencing up large tracts of land, not just the land that they own themselves either, but also public land. So they were putting barbed wire over public roads, over public waters. I can't remember the county off the top of my head, but there was an entire county that the county seat was completely enclosed by barbed wire. So if you were a farmer who wanted to go and complain, you actually had to cut through the barbed wire to be able to reach the county.
Hilarious.
It was a huge fervor, and this came into conflict with a few different groups. I mean, I opened up the piece talking about what it meant for Native people in Texas with a Pueblo chief who got lost on his way back to Taos, New Mexico, who got lost and ended up on Charles Goodnight, who's a very famous like Texas rancher's land, and and was lost. And when the Charles Goodnight came up and talked to him, he was like, how are you lost? Like you should, this land better than anyone else. And he said, wires everywhere. So it had a really devastating effect on the land, and it also had a really devastating effect on a kind of concept that's big in the West, which was the concept of the open range, which is that the land sort of belonged to all. And then especially for free grazing, freedom of movement, these barbed wire fences that were being put up across Texas and all across the West basically ended in a short period of time something that people had sort of believed as like a founding doctrine of Western society at that time. So you have this big enclosure of the commons of the public land fueled by big corporations, by moneyed interests. And I want to tell this story because it's an interesting one where, barbed wire is like ubiquitous in Texas. Most Texans, like, they grew up around it. Everyone has a story about getting their jeans caught on wire, things like that. But I think it's important to remember that this was something that was very much imposed and was extremely unpopular. And the poor farmers and poor cowboys, oftentimes unlanded, or if they own land, a very small amount of land that they needed to have access to this, public grazing. They didn't just take this sitting down. They almost immediately formed up these gangs of people who went and cut down barbed wire fences with a fervor. And yeah, if you read the piece in Jacobin, I go through some of these stories. But it started out from a very practical aspect. Like, I need to get over here. There's fencing in front of me. I'm going to cut it down. But almost immediately he took on this political character where they weren't just cutting down fencing because they wanted to get somewhere. They were cutting down fencing because they wanted to eradicate it from the state of Texas. And, it was put down brutally. One of the reasons I also want to tell this story is because, I was aware of the fence cutting wars before. But, when I was, I'm a nerd, so I read like Texas history blogs. It's always told in this story of like how Law and Order came to Texas, which I've always found, pretty ridiculous.
Oh my God. That's honestly, it's ridiculous, but like, that's like how a fascist would write history.
Yeah. No, 100%. And like, it's funny to see it being misremembered. I don't want to call these people out because they're just doing history podcasts, but like, there's a Texas ranching history podcast that I was listening to, and the fellow is, telling the stories, having such a hard time being able to deal with the fact that so many Texans were against the system of like private property and enclosure, and sort of mixing it with his worldview of like the history of Texas, which there's a popular narrative of Texas history, which is just like it was settled by people who believed in a free market and limited government. And that's a falsehood. And I think it's important to note that these weren't systems that sort of naturally originated here, but in fact were very much imposed by the ruling class. And it's a very rich history. I think, for people who might study Texas history, just Southern history, it's very much like a prelude to the populist movement and the early American socialist movement, which people forget. But the American socialist movement, some of its strongest areas of support were Texas, were Louisiana, were Oklahoma. And a lot of these people, if not them themselves and their kids, would end up being the people who would populate these early working class movements. So it's a really fascinating story. It's Texas, so it's filled with colorful language. One of my favorite lines from it is when they finally held a special session in the ledge on which is a very hard thing to do even today, but especially if you think about what that meant then, like you had to call people back. One of the guys who was against fence cutting, of course, called the fence cutters these hellhounds of Texas, which I think is such a badass name. They created all these awesome gangs with names like the Blue Devils, the Javelinas, and my personal favorite, the Knights of the Nippers, which is a good one. And for a bit of time, like showing up in a public place like a bar, having a set of nippers, implements used to cut down those fences, was sort of seen as like a badge of honor, a badge of resistance. And yeah, I mean, like, we talk about a lot on this program, but the right wing is doing a lot to frame our history to us in a certain way. And I think it's important to, be able to root yourself a little bit to realize that rather than, history sort of being flat, at all these moments in American and particularly like Texas history, there were people who were standing up and they were fighting back against these systems. And as we're trying to write our own chapters of left-wing working class movements today, I think it's really worthwhile to remember them.
Yeah, I think it's imperative. I think it's like we need to jealously guard this sort of history, because if you think about like what sort of, if there was like an Orwellian Big Brother style, like what history are they going after first? It's going to be resistance to enclosure. And it's everywhere too. Like I guarantee there's some like this is everywhere that basically capital powers try to extend their control over places. People do resist it.
And
yeah.
No, I mean, I think it's an important, like, it's also a good moment of like how a lot of people on the left or right, like the Texas Greenback Party, which, is obviously not like an explicitly socialist party, anything like that, sort of, populism, agrarian populism, which just has good and bad in it. But they predicted that this enclosure that was happening in the West was going to disinherit generations of not just Texans but people across the Southwest and the South, and they were right. I mean, in a period of in the period after the Civil War, you saw all these people who they had very small holdings. I'm talking like very much like subsistence farming, went from being somebody who owned their land to in a couple generations being people who had been completely pushed off it and might be working on land that their father, their grandfather once owned, but is now owned by this big corporation where they're now tenant farmers. And particularly in Oklahoma, this becomes like a part of the big groundswell for the populist movement, right? So I think it's a really dynamic part of American history, and it's worthwhile. I mean, as our friend and teacher Harvey K always reminds us, is like, take hold of your history. Like, it's here, it's there for you, and I think it's very worthwhile and beneficial for us to be able to frame ourselves, not also glorifying, because none of these movements are necessarily perfect or fully articulated at the time. But we are, in a sense, like the inheritors and the children of these movements, and I think it's a good thing for the American socialist movement to become a little bit more proficient too, and being able to understand and talk about these things. That this isn't some weird aberration. For example, the left in the United States, it's actually something that's been here from the get-go.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like against the charge of like, you don't care about this country. It's like, actually, like, I'm a steward of its history.
Yeah, exactly.
That's actually a response. Gore Vidal, somebody accused him of being anti-American. It's like, I'm a biographer of this country. What do you because of the historical fiction he's written. Yeah.
But if people want to dive into it, the piece is called "When Texas Cowboys Fought Private Property." Very happy with that title. There's a link in the show notes, and I'd love to hear what folks think about it. Definitely expect more from me on that. I've been trying to do some chronicling of those movements. The next couple chapters get really expansive, so I'll have to sort of whittle my way down to smaller pieces, but definitely want to be doing more on that.
Very well done, David.
Thanks, Matt. Well, before we get to Brian, I want to do a couple quick pitches. This weekend, we're having Gene Bazelon on the program. He's going to talk to us about the protests in Iran, particularly some of the Kurdish aspects to it. But also, I think the real highlight is not everything is a fucking color revolution. And he's going to help us push back against some of these tendencies on the left that are unable to see any kind of social or political movements in other countries without sort of imagining the CIA as orchestrating them. So you get access to that at patreon.com/Left Reckoning. Last week, we talked about Hal Draper's essay, The Anatomy of the Microsect, which is a very great read. It's very sad sometimes to read something written in the 70s that rings so true about the current state of the American left. But if you didn't get access to that, you can sign up at Patreon to get it. I hope more people listen to that than have so far. And last thing, before we jump over to Brian, don't forget, we're going to be hanging out in Los Angeles on October 23rd at 6 p.m. At the Terragram Ballroom. You can get your tickets now. You can come see me, Matt, Ben Burgess, Jason Miles, Anna Kasparian, Danny Bessner, Kuba, Dr. Kuba of This Is Revolution fame, and see Derek Varn as well. And if you aren't in the Los Angeles area, but you want to find a way to help us out, or if you've already got your tickets, we are also announcing a contest. All three of us are doing it. Ben's doing it. Our friends at This Is Revolution are doing it. I'd really like it if we could win. We are asking for people, if they are artistically inclined, to maybe come up with an image or drawing or some kind of media that we could share to promote the show. And whomever's piece that we decide is the best, we will send you some Left Reckoning merch of your choice. And if you don't want to participate and just buy it, you can get it at leftreckoning.com/store. But we're announcing that contest now. I remember we had really wonderful people at TMBS who were able to put together some great stuff. We've had great stuff on this program as well from a lot of y'all. So send those to leftreckoning@gmail.com if you're so inclined.
Yeah, folks, I'm excited for, Return LA show is, I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think we've set up enough. Should we bring Brian on? Brian's going to be joining us to sort of set the stage a little bit about what happened over the weekend with the first round of elections in Brazil, and paint a little bit of a different picture than some of the things we've been getting from the mainstream media on it. So
yeah, and I think, like, reflecting on it, kind of important too, not to have the doom and gloom narrative so prominent, given that it may give
it's a huge boom.
momentum to a coup.
Yeah.
But yeah, here's Brian.
Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here, joined by Matlick as always.
Howdy.
And we're stoked to be joined by our friend Brian Mier. You know Brian Mier from BrasilWire and also from Telesur English. How's it going, Brian?
Well, better than the corporate media would have you believe, as someone who supports former President Lula.
Yeah, I mean,
bad.
No, I mean, I that's what we brought you on to talk about. I mean, just setting the stage a little bit, there were the first round elections. And while I think a lot of us had hoped that it would be a one and done in the sense that Lula would have crossed 50% to win it outright, a lot of the media coverage so far has been quite dour, that Lula didn't cross that 50% threshold. But I mean, judging from talking to you, we were hanging out a little bit before the stream. I mean, you're not in a very bad mood. I mean, I think there's a lot to be extremely optimistic about from this first round elections. I mean, could you give people a taste of what happened over the weekend?
Well, first of all, the media was setting up Lula to fail, right? So they were exaggerating the probability of a first round victory, which nobody from the Workers' Party has ever pulled off. They took the presidency 4 times already and never happened with a first round victory. There hasn't been a first round victory this century, and a challenger has never even beaten an incumbent in the first round of a presidential election in Brazil since the return to democracy in 1985. So let's go back to 4 years ago, right? In the first round, Bolsonaro had around over 40 million votes. I think it was 49. And challenger Fernando Haddad, who was just put in at the last minute after the Brazilian courts decided to ignore the order from the UN that was legally binding that told them they had to let Lula run. They put Haddad in 30 days before the election. He had like 24 million votes in the first round. Okay, so what happened yesterday was over double that number of votes. Lula got 10 million votes more than he's ever gotten in any election in his life. Okay, that's the reason that the papers and the media was setting Lula up to fail on this was because they were just like misinterpreting your basic election poll. David, you as an economist must know about margin of error and things like that. But like, it doesn't seem like very many journalists know that. I've had to repeat over and over in Brazil and Portuguese on the web TV program where I'm like, look, if Datafolha says it's 50%, what they're really saying that Lula's polling at 50%, they're saying that there's a 95% chance that he's polling between 48 and 52%. That's what the poll means. It doesn't mean he's going to win in the first round. But newspaper after newspaper was just suggesting, oh yeah, he's going to win in the first round, to make it look like anything other than a first round win would be this horrible failure. Another excuse to like beat up on the left. Oh, what did they do wrong? The Guardians like wringing their hands. Oh, the tragedy. Why? How could they be so weak? How could they have not? It would have been great. Like, obviously Lula's saying like, yeah, it would have been great. But they had a victory party after the results came in. And tens of thousands of people came out with Lula on the streets in downtown Sao Paulo, just cheer and commemorate. So obviously, there's some bad things. There's some really shitty results. But for the most part, it's more good than bad. Basically what happened is Bolsonaro beat the spread, according to the polls, which was a little bit scary because they reported in the more conservative states first. So for half of the tallying period, which in Brazil is only 3 hours, compared to the United States.
Yeah.
During that 3 hours, for like the first hour and 20 minutes, Bolsonaro was actually ahead, and that was freaking out a lot of people. But they waited to bring in the results from the Northeast, which is a leftist stronghold in Brazil, at the end. And he passed him up and he won by 6.2 million votes. Proportionally speaking, that would be like over 9 million votes in the U.S. because Brazil has 2/3 the population of the U.S. And the last time that's happened in the U.S. was like 2008, right? Obama and McCain. So that's like a sizable win. It isn't like Lula just eked by Bolsonaro or something. That's 6.2 million votes.
Yeah. And
I
mean, I think
it doesn't. Oh, sorry, David. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I just think it's important to note, well, like why one. I mean, we're obviously covering the second round, and that's a very important election. But it's important to like get these narratives right, I think, too, because this is how like media narratives are going to be framed going into the election season, and it's just like the way that like election results are reported. There is like a kind of like sports match like aspect to it where it's like, oh, what areas are getting their votes counted first, making this kind of narrative of like, oh, well, Lula caught up at the last minute to like, overtake Bolsonaro instead of it just being, kind of random occurrence about what votes were being tallied versus others.
Yeah. It's just like, I mean, sports, for good and for bad. I mean, people say that Americans or people from the United States are better at statistics because of baseball than people in a lot of other countries because they don't really use stats, for example, in soccer, football, as they say. And you go to countries where people don't play baseball, and they're normally not that good at statistics. But we all know that they're ridiculous, meaningless statistics just presented in any baseball game for entertainment purposes, or a basketball game or whatever. Because I mean, it's like, look, if you're going into like how many times in postseason has this or that happened, you've already really diminished the pool, the statistical pool, right? And there's things like that. But in this, and I could say, okay, so an incumbent has never lost a first round election. That's not such an important statistic. It's almost like one of these meaningless sports statistics, except that it is true, and so it's worth mentioning. And there have been a lot of elections. So, but it's not like I'm not building on thousands of elections to generate the statistic from it. I guess you could say it's more of an anecdote than a true statistic. I don't mean to be getting too much into statistics, David. I just know that you are a statistician, you're an economist. So.
You might be buttering me up, but I hear you.
Yeah, so isn't it basically the case that Lula did about what you would expect, maybe within the margin of error, and Bolsonaro overperformed basically at the cost of third parties? Is that basically what we're seeing? And also comment on, Bolsonaro being sort of anti-census, and that may be leading into why these polls were so wrong.
Well, there's two things going on. I think as the time passes, there's new information coming out. Okay, so first of all, Ciro Gomez, Glenn Greenwald's choice, right? For the last 3 months, he's been using just out of control, attacking Lula daily. And Bolsonaro has been using Ciro's campaign to attack Bolsonaro and to attack Lula. And Ciro's been actually using like fashware style political ads, and he had some really slick campaign manager. And it looked like he was actually just staying in the race to sabotage Lula's campaign and bring it to the final round to prevent him from winning the first round. And so at the last minute, his support cut in half. And the director of one of the larger polling agencies in Brazil, Quest, it's called, I don't know how to pronounce it right in English, but he just said, look, most of the votes that went to Bolsonaro had migrated from Ciro Gomez. So Ciro Gomez had literally been like comparing Lula to the devil and stuff. I mean, they're former allies. It was just disgusting to watch. He was just a spoiler. And he was attacking Lula on abortion rights issues, like calling Lula a baby killer and all this crap, which is just not, blaming the current economic problems on Lula's government. Lula's been out of power for 12 years. It's just like, it was just outrageous. And so it looks like a lot of, a significant number of his followers jumped. And then it looks like Bolsonaro picked up a little bit more than expected because turnout was lower. And this, I think, has the stamp of Bannon on it, really, because they filled the polling centers with Bolsonarista volunteers, right? And Bolsonaro spent, as everyone knows, he spent the last year and a half trying to usurp confidence in the election process, right? There's going to be fraud, it's acceptable to fraud. It looks like what they might have been doing is deliberately slowing down the lines to drive up abstentions. And abstentions ended up much higher than usual, not much higher, but higher than usual. In the states where Bolsonaro had the least support, it looks like the lines were longer. And one of the reasons is they put this biometric system in that was optional. People who wanted could use the biometrics. But it looks like the biometrics were running much slower than they had run in tests. And so, for example, here in Recife, I was down in Sao Paulo, but in Recife, where I'm living now, my wife tells me that the lines were like 4 hours long. They changed some of the voting centers at the last minute. And they unusually, like, they legalized drinking in most of the country. Like, they don't normally have bars open on election day. And so I think a lot of people are like, oh, let's go out and vote and then we'll meet at the bar. Because Sunday's like a major drinking day in Brazil. It's like part of the culture. Brazil has a big drinking culture anyway. A lot of people don't drink all week, and they'll just drink from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed on Sunday, right? Barbecue and stuff like that. And so, like, I think a lot of people were just like, oh, I'll go vote and then I'll meet my friends at the barbecue or at the bar or whatever. And they got there and the line was too big, and they're like, oh, whatever. It's just the first round, you know? So it looks like that. Because, you know, like, even in U.S. politics especially, right, anywhere in the world, abstentions always favors the incumbent. That's why political machines try to drive down participation. It's been the secret of the Daley family in Chicago since the 1950s.
Yeah, I mean, that stuff is classic, changing polling places and understaffing them so people have to wait in super long lines. We've seen that in the Twitter era of just insanely long, in the drone footage era. You know, this is a very modern and tried and true strategy.
Yeah, but you know, the thing that's really fucked about this, if you don't mind my swearing on your show, is that you know, because Bolsonaro and his military allies have spent the last year and a half mining away at confidence in the electoral system, now if leftists start complaining about it, we've been defending it for the last year and a half. Yeah. So if that's what they really did on purpose, then that to me seems like Bannon, you know, style strategy. And, you know, they're constantly communicating. On September 7th, my friend who I was just mentioning to you guys, Danny Shaw, was down here in Rio de Janeiro. And just because he's like a super tall American guy and he's bald and he's a former boxer. So they probably just assumed he was right wing in this pro Bolsonaro rally he was walking through. They invited him up on top of a sound car and he bumped into Jason Miller. He was like, sent me a WhatsApp like, I just met this guy named Jason Miller. Who's Jason Miller? It's like, well, what's Jason Miller doing on a sound car on a Bolsonaro rally? Because obviously these guys are communicating the whole time, right? And so that could have been like a kind of strategy. But even if it wasn't enough to prevent Lula from beating him by 6.2 million votes. And I feel like abstentions are going to be a lot lower in the second round because people are going to be like, you know, shit, we have to win this thing. I can't go to the barbecue. I'm going to wait.
Well, you can after Lula wins, right?
That drives me crazy. That conflation of the two different concerns about the electoral process, right? Like from the right, it's not like our concerns is that votes aren't being collected and counted that should be collected and counted. Theirs is that there's some conspiracy to like stuff the ballots, and those are fundamentally not the same thing. And it's very frustrating when particularly like high-profile journalists conflate those two things. As look, both sides do the fear-mongering about election integrity.
Yeah, it's just I don't know. In general, though, I will say that elections in Brazil are a lot smoother than they are in the U.S. You know,
it's interesting. You mentioned we've talked before about the computer ballots, which is something I'm scared of. Like I'm old-fashioned. I want all paper ballots, but if it works, you
want hanging chads.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Old-fashioned.
Well, Brian, obviously we want to talk a little bit about the outlook and some of the characters. Obviously we can't go through this entire map, but if you were to give, Americans who might not be familiar, with Brazil, the political geography, etc., so it's like anything that sort of stands out for you or anything that you think is sort of worth highlighting about some of these results that we got from the first round?
All I see is a big black blotch on the screen.
Oh,
Oh, for real?
So, power outages have been a problem in some polling stations. No, I don't know.
yeah, it's definitely it's definitely our issue. Well, we can.
No, I can describe it. It was a map that divided the country into red and blue. Unlike the United States, the Workers' Party actually does use the color red as its official color, so it's more apt. And what it's showing basically is that in 2018, the only region that Fernando Haddad carried in the election was the Northeast. That's the part of the Brazilian map that looks kind of like an arm coming out, right? It's the part that goes east like that. From around here to around here, well, here to around here, that's the Northeast, right? You see that's all in red on the map that we can't see right now. But basically what it's showing is that this time around, in addition to the northeast of Brazil, here we go. So you see there's that kind of like elbow pointing out there on the right. In addition to that region, which is all pink, right? Lula carried the north. Okay, he carried the north, and so that's two regions. Now you see all these big blue states that are kind of below the top part, the north there, going down. Those are states with really low populations, right? The real population center of Brazil is the southeast. This map is breaking it down by county, right? There's over 5,000 counties in Brazil. But you see if you look down below the elbow part sticking to the right of the image there, there's one state that's outlined in black. That's Minas Gerais. It's the third most populated state in Brazil, and Lula also carried that. You can't tell because it's showing some counties in blue, but overall, Lula also carried that. He lost in Rio and São Paulo, which is, a pretty big deal. It's pretty disgusting, really. That if it weren't for Rio and São Paulo, he would have won in the first round. So Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo really cost him a first round victory.
What would you attribute that to? I mean, I know it's pretty early, but how's the campaigning and the politics looking in those parts of the country?
Well, Rio de Janeiro is Bolsonaro's stronghold, and it's also the first state in Brazil that ever became majority evangelical Christian. So I was expecting him to carry Rio de Janeiro. São Paulo was polling about even, and Bolsonaro ended up winning by about 7 points there. That's disturbing. And the gubernatorial race just didn't pan out at all like it had been polled. Fernando Haddad was leading by like 10 points, and he ended up coming in second, like 8 points or something behind Bolsonaro's candidate, who isn't even from the state of São Paulo, is from Rio. Just another one of these clown candidates who doesn't have any governmental experience or anything, former military. But, there's all kinds of super interesting stuff that happened at the different level elections. You can't call this in any way, shape, or form a defeat when the Workers' Party gained. The Workers' Party returned its presence in Congress to the same level it had when Dilma Rousseff was president. There's been 6 years of suffering, of PT getting hit, constantly in the media, and they're back to where they were when Dilma was president. They picked up 12 new members of Congress. Their congressional levels grew, I don't know what it is, by 20-something%. And in the Senate, which has never been a PT stronghold, it's never been a left stronghold, but they picked up 3 more senators since 2019, which represents a 50% increase for them. And then in the state legislature of São Paulo, they grew by 80% and transformed into the second biggest party in the legislature. And there's all kinds of really, because in 2016, the laws changed and all the political parties it's not enough to have ethnic equity among your candidates. You have to spend your party fund equitably according to the ethnicity of the candidates. So all of a sudden, all of these parties have to have equity in elected officials being Afro-Brazilian, because Brazil's 52% Black, And there's all these really interesting young politicians coming up within the Workers' Party that did historic firsts, like in Paraná, Sergio Moro's state, his home state. Carol D'Artora became the first ever Black woman congressperson from that state. And she's not an identity politics, generic Kamala Harris type or something. She was a teachers union leader before she was elected to city council 2 years ago. And she's already a federal congresswoman. She's a rising star within the party. And there's all kinds of examples. The landless workers movement decided to get involved in politics this year, and they elected 6 state or federal members of Congress, showing that they're a political force to be reckoned with. And they're, straight up socialists. They fight for agrarian reform, for disappropriating land, the plantations and the big agribusiness plantations from the rich, because those people didn't buy the land; they just stole the land.
I mean, so there's certainly a lot that we saw in like the lower ballot races that's very encouraging for PT and the left in general. But I mean, could you give people a sense at some of the more unfortunate results, and also what that would mean, God willing, Lula's, is able to carry into the second round, what that would mean for, who he would be governing with when he becomes president?
Well, yeah, the bad news is like some of the worst, most nefarious, like anti-political clown characters from Bolsonaro's cabinet got into Senate, like Damares Alves, who claims that Jesus gave her master's degree.
That's fake.
She didn't actually study at a university, but she said she had a master's on her resume. No, Jesus gave it to me. Evangelicals have a different relationship with education. And also that, she spoke to Jesus once in a guava tree. She has conversations with Jesus. And so she's now a fucking senator, which is ridiculous. That's disgusting. But the worst thing is Sergio Moro getting elected to the Senate, because he was getting his ass kicked in the polls. And I don't know what happened, but basically this means he's protected for the next 8 years from any criminal prosecution. He's got like 12 investigations against him right now. And for those who don't know, Moro was he was the judge who ruled over the investigation into Lula, and he was allowed to rule on the only investigation he oversaw with no jury, in this bizarre legal loophole that goes back to the Inquisition, basically. I mean, his role in that whole process, literally, according to Portuguese law, is inquisitor. He's literally an inquisitor. And now we know, of course, that it was all just spurious charges with no evidence.
And when it comes to borrow some language from our evangelical friends, to repenting, it doesn't look like Moro's too interested in this. He's throwing his weight behind the beneficiary of his first investigation, Bolsonaro.
Yeah, and it's funny because they were pretending to be, and he was pretending to not like Bolsonaro for a while when he resigned from his cabinet. He was acting like he and Bolsonaro were enemies, but now they're back together. So,
well, other important figures. I mean, could you just briefly remind people who might have forgotten or don't know who Ciro Gomez is, and what's going on with him when it comes to this second round race between Bolsonaro and Lula?
Well, Ciro Gomez is a career politician and opportunist who has switched political parties 5 times. He's been in right-wing parties and left-wing parties. He was part of the right-wing Itamar Franco government and helped push through the most neoliberal anti-inflation plan ever executed in Latin America, which literally put Brazil in the Guinness Book of World Records for highest interest rates. And I remember, because I was in Brazil then, like everyone was like, "Oh, this is so great." Like, no, it's not great. My credit card's now charging 13% per month interest. That was the result of Ciro Gomez's. But he's shifted more and more to kind of like the center left for a while. He was a cabinet minister in Lula's government. And he ran in 2018. And up until that point, he was always saying that Lula was unjustly imprisoned and that people were being unfair with the PT. But then it looks like he got more and more pissed off because the PT didn't nominate him as the candidate and get behind his candidacy. Because his argument was that there was such a climate of anti-left sentiment, anti-PT sentiment. You needed someone more in the middle. So he was running from the right of the PT with the argument that he'd be able to govern better. And he ended up getting like 13%. in the first round. And then instead, he was so pissed off that the PT wouldn't back him that instead of like pledging his votes to Fernando Haddad in the second round and helping with the campaign, he flew to Paris and took a vacation for a month.
Nice.
Right. And then since then, he's just been like more and more antagonistic towards the Workers' Party and towards the left. And he has anger management issues. You know, he's blown up when Lula was in jail, he was trying to go around the country and show himself as the new future for the left. And people would start talking about Lula and he would just scream, "Lula's in jail, you asshole," and stuff like that. And then you know, Greenwald started backing him, which is a bad sign, you know, because Greenwald's never backed anyone in the PT anyway. So it's a bad sign. Then it looked like there's always this kind of spoiler who pretends to be a progressive alternative in every election in Latin America. It was Jaco Perez in Ecuador. Yeah. You know, there's always someone who comes out. It was Marina Silva filled this role for a while in Brazil. And that's what Ciro did in 2018. And I predicted when Greenwald like called up this podcast I was on with Ewan Higgins.
Yeah, that's right.
He called up and like argued with me for an hour. Like he wasn't even invited on the show. And he was just like screaming at me, "Ciro's a lifelong man of the left. How dare you? He's to the left of Lula. He's running to the left of Lula. You know, how dare you call him a spoiler?" So anyway, he was wrong. So he's been really quiet about things. He tried to commit character assassination of Lula on election day. He tweeted out that the electoral court's ordering of this right-wing media site called Antagonista to pull off an obviously doctored audio in which someone claiming to be this drug kingpin, you know, expressed support for Lula in the election. He said that was censorship, that this site was a victim of censorship, and that even though I don't support what they stand for, I have to, as the most ethical and moral human being on the face of planet Earth, defend them at this moment. You know, because it's only election day. You know?
Yeah.
It's like there is a rule of law in Brazil, and for the last like couple of years, the left have been saying we have to rebuild the rule of law. So if you're going to attack the rule of law on election day, you're on Bolsonaro's side. That's what Bolsonaro's been doing for the last year, saying that you trust the electoral courts.
Yeah, Brian, I don't know if you saw, but Glenn did tweet about the election today. Actually,
now I didn't see it, but I saw that. Yeah.
So The Economist writes, a second term for Jair Bolsonaro, who spreads misinformation and undermines trust in democracy, would be bad for Brazil and the world. Only Lula can prevent it, claiming the center ground is the best way to do so. And Glenn says, this is the most Economist tweet ever. But it's also more evidence of the fact that the Western establishment fears right-wing populism more than left liberal politics. So I don't know if you have a response to that, Brian.
Yeah, sure. The only way you could make that argument about Lula is if you wrote an entire book about Lava Jato and didn't once mention U.S. Department of Justice and FBI involvement in that investigation that was revealed by your own former employer, Intercept, with the leaks that he obviously sat on this information for like a year and didn't release it. It was only released by other journalists inside the Intercept. He doesn't even mention U.S. involvement. I mean, Hank Johnson and Susan Wild and, you know, Ilhan Omar and a group of like 16 members of Congress have repeatedly sent inquiries to the Department of Justice for them to clarify their role in Lula's imprisonment, in his political imprisonment. And one of the responses from the DOJ is like, we've been talking about our partnership in Lava Jato, Operation Car Wash, on our own website since 2016. There's publicly available information. Yet Glenn has never mentioned that. He doesn't mention it in his book. So if in your mind the U.S. wasn't involved in Lula's imprisonment or in Lava Jato, then maybe you could say, oh, the U.S. really likes Lula. If they like Lula so much, why did they help put Bolsonaro in power? You know, that's the first. The second thing, it's even more obvious. Like, ask Glenn to name the political party of Bolsonaro. Like, Glenn, what party are you talking about? What party is he in? What party is Bolsonaro in? Come on, Tucker and Glenn, name the party. Well, the name of the party is the Liberal Party. Bolsonaro's literally, leading the Liberal Party, and his economics chief is a classic neoliberal who studied under Milton Friedman at University of Chicago in the 1970s. Apparently, like the most mediocre of the Chicago boys.
Is that anti-establishment Bolsonaro? Bolsonaro versus the establishment and the whole media and everything. Is that for domestic consumption in Brazil too, or is that just something like Tucker talks about here?
I think he tries to copy Trump, so it's also for domestic consumption. But all the polls show that the biggest support demographic for Lula the entire time, his entire life, his 50-year political career, it's always been people making less than 2 times the minimum wage. This year, they're more than 2 times more likely to vote for Lula than Bolsonaro. They're the only economic demographic that supports Lula. Mm-hmm. The problem is for Bolsonaro that 70% of the Brazilian population makes less than 2 times the minimum wage. Every other economic bracket upwards, supports Bolsonaro. The people making over 10 times the minimum wage are almost twice as likely to vote for Bolsonaro than Lula. And of course, Bolsonaro's backers are all, I guess you could call them comprador bourgeoisie or comprador elites. They're like, billionaires and multimillionaire Brazilians. And we see obviously Fox likes him, and obviously Chevron and the big pesticide companies and the mining industry likes him a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't see like if Wall Street Journal has weighed in this time, but they did endorse him in 2000.
They endorsed him last time, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Fox is endorsing him. I bet. Well, Murdoch endorsed. It's Murdoch Industries or whatever. So I'm sure Wall Street Journal will endorse him again.
Well, let's look a little bit in the words of the man himself about what he's been saying. Oh, shit! I don't know how that got on there. But
that's what Tucker said.
Here's one of the tweets that Bolsonaro has made recently. I'll read it for the podcast audience. Also, let us know if the Google Translate is way off, Brian. But Bolsonaro said the equivalent of, against everything and everyone, we had a more expressive vote in the first round of 2022 than the one we had in 2018. There are almost 2 million more votes. We have also elected the largest benches in the House and Senate, which was our top priority at this first moment. I mean, how do you feel about Bolsonaro's characterization of this election so far?
It's misleading because per capita, he hasn't had any increase. Mm-hmm. Because there's more people voting this time around, and the population has grown a little bit. Number of registered voters has grown a little bit, and it wasn't 2 million. He says almost 2 million. There was like 1 million, 0.2 or something. And he lost by 6.2 million votes.
That's about to say it's a lot less than what he needs, right?
Yeah. I mean, he now needs, like 4 votes for every 1 vote that Lula has to pick up to beat Lula. Right. But, you don't know, you never know what can happen, but it definitely looks better for Lula than it does for him right now. The only worry is this kind of like, are they gonna keep doing this thing with the biometrics and try and slow things down? But I don't think it'll be enough. And you know what? It's very deceiving to say we won the largest number of seats in the House and Senate. That's completely deceiving because the Liberal Party, which he and his liberal elite buddies belong to, is almost like a rent-a-party. And so there's a tradition in Brazil where everyone in the center right and the right tries to stick to the person who's in power. They feel like it's a way to get elected. They had the majority before. The parties all changed. Like Bolsonaro changed parties. He was elected as a representative of the Social Liberal Party. That party disappeared into thin air. It merged with another party. But the year he got elected, that had the largest number of seats in the Senate and Congress. And now it's just disappeared into thin air. It doesn't even exist anymore. It's not like a real party. And so all it means is that even at the height of Lula's popularity, when he was polling in the 80% range, the left only had about 25% control of Congress because there was a Congress and Senate during the military dictatorship. And when the dictatorship ended, they simply allowed all of those people to hang on to their seats. And they would only leave office if they had lost an election. And, it always favors the incumbents. So since then, these 2 parties that have descended from those 2 official dictatorship parties have always together held a majority in the House and Senate. And so this is really no different. Like one of the official dictatorship parties is part of Bolsonaro's coalition.
Well, in the last couple of minutes, in a second, I want to ask you about your sort of outlook, for a second round. But Benjamin Fogel was on our friends the American Prestige podcast recently, and he made a point. One of his kind of takeaways from this first round is that it seems not necessarily a majority, but it seems that there is a kind of entrenched Bolsonaro kind of supporting a Bolsonaro like ideology that is going to be a force in Brazilian politics for the time being. And I was curious if you agree with that or not. Like Bolsonaro and what he sort of unleashed is going to last longer than he might as a presidential candidate.
Well, look, I've been living in Brazil for 27 years, right? There's always been that part of Brazilian politics. It used to be a guy named Paulo Maluf, who was governor of Sao Paulo and mayor of Sao Paulo. He supported death squads. When he was governor, he had police beat up anybody they caught on the street without a signed work card. He divided the population into bums and workers. So I got a friend who was arrested when he went out looking for a job. He was black too. He spent 2 weeks in jail and got beaten up because he was out on the street with his resume looking for a job and didn't have a work contract with him. And you have these legalized death squads operating out of the military police because the military police were never like dictatorships. They were left to exist on after the dictatorship in a kind of state of exception. Military police officers don't respond to the normal rule of law. So first it was Maluf. All of the crazy right-wing people you knew would support Maluf. Then there was a guy named Enéas, who was like literally a fascist, who became the most voted congressman in the history of Sao Paulo. And so what you have is, ever since I moved to Brazil, it's been like 20-25% fascist. What you have is a bit of a spike with Bolsonaro. And I think that's just because of this tendency of Brazilian people. It goes back to like colonial times and stuff like that, of like wanting to be on the winning side in the political dispute. So I think there's a swing of people who side over to Bolsonaro, but these hardcore fascists, they say about half of his followers are really like hardcore fascist types. And the other half are just like, in my opinion, people who don't know that much about politics, maybe, or just really religious or something. This 18%, 20% of the Brazilian population, it's always been here since Nazi times in the 1930s, and it's not going anywhere. We'll have a big problem when Lula wins that so many Bolsonaro allies are in the House and Senate. But when Lula was president before, the House and Senate was full of far right-wing operatives, Maybe they were just a little bit more polite. I think that has more to do with social media, the fact that everyone's so confrontational now, than with any kind of like shift that Brazil is more fascist than it was before, in my opinion.
Well, I just want to, I'm sure we're definitely be covering this election a lot this month. So this isn't the final analysis or anything like that, but we're sitting here a couple days after that first round election. What do you think is going to be, do you think there's going to be much of a pivot in the way Lula's campaigning going into the second round, or do you think he's going to continue, hitting the same issues that he's been? What's your feeling? What should people be watching for in the next couple of weeks?
The coalitions he has to set up to get support from the third and fourth place candidates. He's already got support from Ciro's party, PDT. And Ciro today already said, whatever you do, don't vote for Bolsonaro, vote for the other guy. But he wouldn't say Lula's name. All Lula needs is half of those votes. And he's already won the election because Ciro got like 3.3%, right? So even if half of them come to him, and then the other candidate who did better than Ciro, who inched him out for third place, Simone Tebet, is from the MDB party. It was the official opposition party during the military dictatorship. It was kind of like the Democratic Party in the US. It had some more left-wing people in it. The dictatorship basically just copied the US. We said, okay, we can have two parties. All the other parties we're not going to allow them to exist. And within that like broad tent of the MDB, you had some real right-wing jerks, and you also had couple left-wing people who joined other parties after the end of the dictatorship. But it's important to note they backed Lula. They were part of Lula's coalition from 2004 to 2015, ending up holding the vice presidential spot with Dilma Rousseff and then stabbing her in the back and going forwards with the impeachment. So there's a lot of reasons to not trust them. At the same time, they have been an important ally of the PT in the past. And so, maybe there's a better chance that she'll come on board with Lula. In the last debate, it looked like she was talking about future, partnership with Lula. So I think she said she's going to make an announcement in the next couple of days. I think they're going to go with Lula as well. And if that happens, it's going to be really hard for Bolsonaro. Or his American handlers. Far-right American puppet masters.
Well, Brian, it's a pleasure, as always, to have you on the program. People want to read more about some of the arguments that Brian laid out. You can read his pieces in BrasilWire. Media spins Lula victory as defeat. As always, make sure you're reading Brian at BrasilWire, checking out his work at Telesur. And thank you so much. We're always honored to have you on the program.
It's always great to talk with you guys. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you. The man, Brian Mier. It's always great having him on the program.
Yeah, I like him. Talk about your economist skills.
No, I appreciate it very much, but maybe an overstatement. No, I also like when Brian's in a good mood. I mean, we've had so many conversations with Brian, both on this program and on TMBS when the news was very bad. So it's nice to be able to have something to celebrate. But yeah, y'all, we have much more to get to. We get this a lot. People want to know about nonprofits and the left, and we have some criticisms of them. We were joined by Ben Fong and Melissa Naschek to talk about one of their pieces they wrote a little while ago in Catalyst, Jacobin's Theory Journal. Before we get to that, though, I just want to remind folks, one, we're going to be in Los Angeles October 23rd with a whole host of guests. You get your tickets at Telegram Ballroom. It's also going to be my 30th birthday, y'all. So it'd be really great to get a crowd out there and celebrate. This weekend, we're going to be joined by Jean Bazelon for the bonus episode. You get access to that patreon.com/leftreckoning. We're going to be talking about the protests in Iran, another dive into that, looking at the Kurdish side and the Kurdish factor in those protests, but also making the point that I think a lot of people need to hear, that not everything is a fucking color revolution. And Jean Bazelon, I think, has the same kind of righteous anger on those things as we do. So look out for that on Sunday and get access to that by signing up and becoming a patron. But yeah, I mean, unless you had anything else up, I can set this interview up with y'all. So, I mean, we talked about all during the piece. I was a bad host, and I neglected to draw y'all's attention to a book coming out by Ben Fong, who you'll be meeting in a second. They'll be coming out next year from Verso, called Drugs and American Capitalism, a look at drugs through the lens of societal change and a look at social change through the lens of drugs. So keep your eye out for that book. And also, keep your eye out for any work that Ben and Melissa do, whether it's in Catalyst or in Damage Magazine, which I'm a huge fan of. You definitely want to keep these folks on your radar. But I don't know, without any further ado, we're going to dive right into the question of nonprofits and the left, and I hope you enjoy it. Actually, wait, before we go, programming note. Once this is over, Matt and I won't be coming back. We'll be going right over to the post game. Get access to that patreon.com/leftreckoning. Post game was at 87. Pizza Boss is exposed. Should be fun. And don't forget also to leave us a voicemail at 1940-289-7234.
Also, we keep saying we're done talking about them, but there's a funny MAGA communism video I think we need to watch.
Hell yeah.
Patreon.com/leftreckoning, folks. And also, come out to David's 30th birthday bash in LA.
In Los Angeles. All right, y'all. Here's Ben and Melissa. Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David Griscom here, and I'm really thrilled to be joined by these two guests. When y'all send in questions to us, a lot of times we get asked about the role of nonprofits and NGO work. And we've been meaning to do something on this for a long time, and I couldn't think of two better folks to be joining us to talk about this subject. Today, we are joined by Ben Fong and Melissa Naschek, authors of this really excellent piece, which you can find in Catalyst. It was published last year, called NGOism, The Politics of the Third Sector. Melissa and Ben, thank you all so much for coming on here today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, well, let's dive right in. I mean, most people, I think, know what nonprofits are and NGOs are, but if y'all could just give people a brief understanding so that they know what we're talking about, like what are NGOs and why has their role in left politics, however we're defining that, created such a problem for the left?
I could tackle this first one. I think, as most of your listeners probably know, nonprofits, or the third sector broadly defined, it's neither business nor government, right? That's why it's a third sector. And they're oftentimes classified as 501c3s. It's a sort of like technical, like tax designation, but there are a lot of different kinds of designations like that. And as far as the sort of like problem for left politics, I mean, in the broadest sense, I think you could just think about it as the problem of charity, right? Doing something for someone else. And it's a good thing in the abstract. But what it means for the left is that it's an attempt to alleviate certain social problems without taking on the fundamental class divide in society, right? So it's leaving that class divide alone, definitely doing some good things to alleviate some of the symptoms of capitalist society, but without tackling the sort of root of the problems. I think that would sort of be the broad sort of gauge conception of it. Melissa, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I think to Dave's question about why is this becoming more of a problem, the problem is that these are the institutions that increasingly are being tasked with administering social welfare and taking care of social problems that leftists are often the most concerned with and see as the sort of goals of their politics. So they're institutions that the left is forced to kind of deal with, whether it wants to or not. Often it does, which is then kind of its own issue, which we talk about in the piece. So the problem is, on the one hand, how do you understand and deal with these institutions that are now a really important part of both politics and dealing with social problems? And then on the other hand, assessing whether or not these institutions are actually well suited to deal with these problems.
Yeah, and I mean, like on that, like how would you describe it? And again, I highly suggest people read the piece. It's a really good read, and I really appreciate the history, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But Melissa, I mean, how would you describe the NGO's approach to tackling these social social problems? And y'all coined a phrase, NGOism, and it'd be great if you could sort of break that down for us as well.
Yeah, so we kind of took it from, a lot of the inspiration behind this piece was to we started from the perspective of trying to understand political behaviors that we were consistently seeing on the left that seemed to us very self-defeating, and also not particularly obvious for what the stated goals of the left are, which is to build a mass working class movement. So we kind of started from there and then dug more into both the history of nonprofit organizations and studying sort of like what their common approaches are to politics. So we kind of identified what we think are three main aspects of how NGOs approach social problems, both in their sort of like service-based activity that's not necessarily political, and in their explicitly political activities. So those were a technocratic approach to problem solving, a service-oriented model of what basically solutions should be to social issues, and then a focus at the level of the community. So yeah, we can dig into any of those more. I don't know if Ben, you want to start by talking about one or something. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, as we said before, the way in which the left like interacts with like the sort of third sector or like nonprofit world, there's coalition partners, right? In any kind of like political coalition, you're going to get nonprofits that are partners there. So you work with them organizationally. There are people who enter left spaces who also work for nonprofits, and so they bring some of the tactics and strategies that they think about in that world into left spaces. And then more generally, there's just this sort of like more free-floating ideology, I guess you could call it, that springs from the structural constraints of the nonprofit world, but is very easily and uncomfortably ported into other spaces. And I think that's what we were most concerned with, like the fact that NGOs operate in a certain way, just how Melissa just laid out, technocratic, service-oriented, community-driven. It makes sense within the nonprofit world. It bears those structural constraints, and it's not going to challenge the basics of capitalist society, but it makes sense in that world. Outside of that world, it's just sort of inherently self-limiting. And so just trying to call out the sort of errors in porting that strategy outside of the nonprofit world is a large part of what we were interested in the piece.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I think this becomes a really important question because anyone who's been involved in political campaigns over the past few years knows what those interactions are like. And you know, as we're trying to build a socialist movement, democratic socialist movement in this country, you know, there are a lot of things that have been inherited, I think, into that movement that are worth uncovering. And I think one of the important points that y'all make about the NGOs is the kind of the characters who sort of are running those systems. So like what classes are really running the nonprofit world? And, you know, could you talk about that a bit? And then also how nonprofits as a way to sort of tackle social problems. I mean, these are institutions that are markedly different from any kind of like membership based organization. And, you know, if you could sort of, you know, highlight the difference between those two structures, I think that'd be really helpful for our audience to get the crux of the critique here.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most remarkable things about this topic in general is just how obvious nonprofit politics are to our generation, broadly defined. You know, I mean, nonprofits and foundations like, you know, created our textbooks. They funded our after-school programs. Like there's just it's the sort of like world that we live in. It's like water to a fish or something. But before the 60s, there was a much, you could say, clearer understanding of what the foundations and nonprofits were doing. And there were a lot of attacks on them. I mean, the Rockefeller Foundation couldn't actually get a charter from Congress because the Rockefeller name was so odious. I think this was after the Colorado strike. So there was a sort of clear-eyed understanding of what was going on. And then in the 60s, you know, at hearings, I think that they were convened by Wright Patman in the 60s. You know, the foundations again sort of came under scrutiny, and out of that emerged legislation and also just sort of like self-imposed accountability practices that made nonprofits much more professionalized and technocratic. So, you know, this was the beginning of nonprofit management programs like MAs run by universities. This is the beginning of different self-reporting techniques and methods that nonprofits still engage in. And as a result, the people attracted to nonprofits, especially the sort of like bigger ones, increasingly became professionalized, right? They became professional class actors. And that was combined with a sort of large shift in the associational world away from mass membership organizations and unions toward these more lean advocacy organizations driven by professionals. And in that kind of dynamic, you get, you know, what you get anytime you see like networks of professionals, right? A really self-insulated world. But without that accountability to membership, it becomes really self-insulated. And so a lot of the problems, you could say, of the nonprofit world are simply resulting from the fact that it is college-educated people acting for others, but not necessarily with their input.
Yeah, and I think to continue on the historical thread, what's really interesting is that in the 60s, there was it was a huge pivotal time for nonprofits because it's the first time that really nonprofits are explicitly receiving government funding. And this was like something that the Ford Foundation really pioneered. They had this idea that, you know, what's wrong with our institutions, and in particular our institutions that serve poor people, is that they don't understand the problems of the poor. You know, they're not they're not responsive to the needs of the poor. And so their idea was that you could take these entities that were non-governmental entities, fund them, and then sort of use them to basically like cohere people together from the community and use that as a vehicle for social change. And what's interesting is like there are some like wrong assumptions built in there. I think in particular this idea that what's wrong with our institutions is that they just don't understand the problem is obviously a highly idealist and non-materialist understanding of why our institutions don't adequately and equally serve everyone in our community. But what's interesting is they sort of take this idea of nonprofits as this vehicle basically for radical interest group articulation. And in the 60s, what happens is a lot of these groups become extremely politically active, extremely politically forceful, and wind up embarrassing the government agencies that funded them in the first place, because all of a sudden they're marching on, city halls telling them that they don't care about poor people and they're not servicing them. And so then what happens is, government officials are like, well, we don't want to be funding institutions that are telling us that the government sucks and we're not doing our job. And so this other wing that was responsible for putting together this program, which had always been uncomfortable with this idea that nonprofits should be used to push against the government, sort of won out, and then transformed, these vehicles that are meant to perform this function of improving government services into much more muted groups. And now they look a lot more like what that wing wanted, which is the nonprofit as basically a way to sort of convene community leaders, heavy air quotes on what a community leader is, and sort of come up with solutions to problems in a way that is not confrontational and is much more reliant on this idea that maybe we can just do a little tweak here, a little tweak there. And that will solve the problem as to why these institutions aren't serving everyone. And so then to your question of what makes that different than a membership organization, the reality of what nonprofits are right now is that they're groups of people who are pre-selected, not by the people whose interests they're tasked with serving, but by other elites. Mm-hmm. Who then have a say in what those interests actually are and how we're going to solve them. So it completely disconnects the notion that an organization should be responsive and should basically be convening the group of people who it's meant to serve and having them essentially articulate their interests and the problems. And instead that all of that should come from people up top who actually know better and are in a better place to tell them what their interests are.
Well, it's a real challenge to democracy, right? I mean, in a sense, it's sort of creating an artificial space for people to go who might be interested or worried about a certain topic, and then you have people who are effectively appointed to be the representatives of different quote communities. I'd be curious. I mean, y'all write about this in the piece. But the relationship here between the growth in nonprofits and the sort of decline of the American welfare system as well.
Mm-hmm.
Go for it, Melissa.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, definitely pick up whatever I don't get into. So yeah, I mean, this was also, again, it really comes back to the 1960s and then sort of takes a turn once neoliberalism is more in effect and sort of the project becomes more deliberate. But also in the 60s, there's this concern, like I said before, that, are we actually really helping poor people? And there's a real aspect to that of we haven't solved poverty, and that's where you get Lyndon Johnson's proclamation of the war on poverty. How are we going to actually try to eradicate this as a form of social existence in the U.S.? And then there's also, the more cynical aspect of it of, do we want to keep funding these programs that, you know, the more that we're taking social welfare seriously, the more money we have to spend on this. And so that's part of what inspired. So it's the Economic Opportunity Act passed in 1964, where they start all these experiments to try to figure out, is there another way than what we've been doing now, which is mostly a combination of direct payments of relief, and then building up certain key social service institutions. And that's where you get, you know, government health care, government education, that kind of thing. So there's already this notion in the 60s of like we should be experimenting to assess like whether or not just like giving money to people is really the right thing. Like maybe we can teach them to sort of help themselves. Obviously, then that's sort of taken to kind of its like logical conclusion when we enter the 80s, and Reagan is very deliberately saying, you know, social welfare and government funded welfare just shouldn't exist. And basically his idea was that originally they wanted to just completely slash federal funding for social welfare. And their idea was like, oh, we already have these like institutions that do all these things. We don't need government, we don't need federal money for this. We can just get rid of it all. And when he tried to just completely eviscerate the social welfare budget, basically everyone, including Republicans, was like, you can't do this. These institutions are actually heavily reliant on government funding. They can't provide these services that you're talking about without any support from us, which was like a complete shock to them. They didn't even, you know, like Reagan really had no conception of how intertwined already the nonprofit sector was with the federal government. And so what he ends up doing is, like to a way lesser degree, slashing the budget than he had originally planned, but he redesigns welfare such that it's no longer about funding programs so that like whoever needs it gets the money. Instead, these programs are repackaged into block grant programs, which is how a lot of our social welfare is run now, which says, here's the amount of money we're designating to deal with this social problem. We'll give you X amount of dollars. You deal with the problem. So what it does is it completely changes the social commitment of social welfare. Instead of saying, we recognize this as a level of social need, now it says, here's how much money we're willing to put towards this social need. And these institutions, these nonprofits, which are non-governmental entities, they're run by non-governmental employees. They run themselves. They're not accountable to the public. You're responsible for figuring out how to deal with this problem. So it completely changes the nature of what social welfare actually should entail, which is, it's really not about need anymore. It's about how much can we get away with not spending on this problem.
Yeah. I mean, I think Melissa, you've covered the sort of like neoliberal period very well, and you know, the Reagan cuts, the Clinton's Personal Responsibility Act in 1996, and you look at a lot of those developments that were a disaster for the poor. They were you know, a windfall of resources for different nonprofit agencies, right? Which is a kind of odd dynamic, obviously. But if we want to go back a little bit further, like even before then, I mean, I think like you could say sort of starting with Reagan, the sort of broader conservative turn in politics and the end of the New Deal order is largely responsible for the gutting of social services, right? But I think, you know, we really take the war on poverty to be a key turning point. And if you compare it to the kind of like relief work in the New Deal, for instance, I think it's like a helpful point of comparison. That, you know, Johnson and allies often look back to the New Deal as a kind of model. Johnson was personally competitive with FDR. He wanted to pass more things than FDR in his first 100 days, all that stuff. And you know, it's not that the New Deal didn't allocate resources to you know, what I don't think the 501c3 designation existed then, but what were nonprofit agencies then. That certainly happened through agencies like the Public Works Administration and whatnot. But if you look at something like the CCC, right, it's not a complicated program. You hire a bunch of poor kids to go plant trees or, like, you know, deal with soil erosion, and you pay them from government coffers. It's very, very straightforward, right? And it was a remarkably popular program. I think the approval ratings were in like the 80s. Roosevelt used the program politically to his own advantage. And it's not extremely complicated, and it's very direct, right? It's the government helping out. In the war on poverty, there were a lot of very convoluted, oftentimes academic theories about why exactly the poor were poor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those theories oftentimes got in the way, ideologically at least, of just sort of like straightforward relief programs. But what they ended up doing was creating sort of devolved community action agencies that didn't help directly, that were about job opportunities rather than jobs, that were about education and training rather than direct relief. And all these things sort of just made it extremely complicated to address what was at root a very basic problem. I think it was, Bayard Rustin who said that like the difference between a rich man and a poor man is that one has money and the other does not. It's a very simple problem to solve, right?
Yeah.
But we've made it very complicated.
Yeah, well, I mean, no, I think that's an important point. And you can see a lot of those pathologies, particularly in like modern like NGO talk. But before we get into some of like, I don't know, the relations between like them and the left, I want to continue hammering home, from our position, from our like ideological understanding of American capitalism. One of the key parts of y'all's argument I found was that just structurally, the way that NGOs are set up, it makes it extremely difficult for them to be able to deal with the fundamental problems of like poverty in this country. And I appreciate that, because a lot of times, we have these things, it's very moralistic. Like if we just had the people with the right hearts, sitting on the boards of NGOs, it'd be different. But y'all make the argument that the way that they're funded and the way that they're set up really actually just from the get-go prevents them from being, agents of the kind of political change that we like to see in this country.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, that came out of a combination of, our own intellectual backgrounds as Marxists, but also just what we saw as issues with the way that the left was talking about nonprofits. And it was always about, either finding people or things that were wrong and then saying, oh, well, it's wrong because they have corporate money, and that explains it, that they're the handmaidens of capital or whatever one of those sayings that gets repeated to explain those sorts of things. Or, like, I know this person who works at this nonprofit and they're like a really radical anti-capitalist. So like whatever they're doing is really good, and like we should really be a part of it. And it provides no insight at all into what these institutions are doing and how to assess them. Because, if all that was wrong with capitalism was that people liked it, I don't think we would have capitalism anymore. Like, I don't think we would have all these issues. So we really wanted to build a way to assess, like, why do these institutions behave the way they do, and what can we regularly expect out of their behavior? So we mostly started looking at the funding, because like the big thing is like nonprofits are kind of defined by a negative, right? Like they're defined by the fact that they're not profit driven. And so like, what does that mean? Because they're still institutions that have to keep themselves afloat. They're not the government. They can't depend on a steady tax revenue. What they do depend on is a combination of grant revenue and individual donations. And those funds they're continuously chasing them down. They're constantly fighting for grant revenue and for donations in order to keep their doors open. So their activity can really be, you can really understand a lot of what they're doing by the fact that they have to keep these revenue streams up in order to survive, in order to make it to the next day. So we started looking at like, where do they get their actual money from? And the answer, I think, actually was pretty surprising to us, that most of their money comes from the government, which is not what I mean, it was not what I thought. I kind of thought like, oh, they're mostly getting money from like foundations or corporations or wealthy people. No, most of it's coming from the government. And that's because most of these institutions are not like inherently political institutions in the sense that like what they're trying to do is like legislate to save the world. Like essentially what they're doing is they're stepping in to provide social services. And that comes often with certain political necessities to like fight to keep this funding alive. But that's really the extent of a lot of their political activity. So for the government funding, there's important political strings that come attached with that. Government funding can't be used for political purposes. So government funding is the most consistent and most reliable source of funds for nonprofits, but it can't be used for political activity. So then we have to look at the other kinds of funding that these organizations receive to understand like where their political constraints are coming from. And the two main sources, or the three, I should say, the three other main sources of money that have a lot less strings attached than the government are private foundations, corporations, and individual donations. Corporations kind of speaks for itself. Corporations are not going to fund political projects that are aimed at the destruction of the profit motive or the redistribution of wealth away from corporations into people's hands. Individual donations and foundations are a little bit more interesting. So foundations, really the interesting thing there is like foundations do usually have, I mean, they have a political agenda. They have, each foundation is pretty idiosyncratic. They're beholden to their boards. Like they all have their different kind of ideologies. There's often conflict within foundations. They're massive institutions. So, whenever you're getting grants from foundations, then whatever political activity that's attached to, you're kind of beholden to their political line. And there's tons of literature of activists just like coming against this reality that even when they're doing political work, that's not at all connected to the grants that they're receiving from the foundations, because they're ultimately financially responsible to these institutions, they are able to basically exert veto power. And there's this great book called Incite, the Revolution Will Not Be Funded, that these organizations talks about their funding getting pulled because, they'll do something and the foundations will say, we don't like that, you have to stop. And they'll say, no, we believe in it. And their funding's gone. And then with individuals, I think this also kind of connects back to the membership question, because the fact that individuals can fund nonprofits is potentially a positive thing. And that's what kind of explains DSA. I mean, DSA is technically a nonprofit, it's 501c3. The difference is that DSA's funding comes from its members. That doesn't get rid of all of the issues that DSA encounters, but it does free it from these like monetary constraints that these other organizations face. But also, when you look at most of these other nonprofits, they're not like relying to a large extent or, to a majority extent, which we would need, on individual donations, on member donations. They're really relying on the donations of wealthy people. So that there's another inequality that people have in their ability to influence these institutions. That's something like liberals really have trouble understanding with these institutions. They say like, oh, look, like, anyone can fund them, can control them. But the reality is there's a huge collective action problem for working and middle class people. They have to pool their resources to be able to match the resources of the wealthy. The wealthy don't have to do that. They can exert a huge amount of influence just by cutting a check. So, yeah.
I mean, just a few points of just to add there. I mean, one on the membership organization. So, as Melissa said, like we're talking about structural tendencies, right? So this isn't to say that in mass membership organizations, you cannot have some kind of bureaucratization. Obviously, like the labor movement in the 60s and 70s is a good example of how even when you have large dues paying memberships, you can find like bureaucratic rigidification in such a way that it like privileges elite actors. So it's not that that can't happen. It's just that in the nonprofit sector, it is structurally baked into the very institutions, right? And then the second thing is that, I mean, in the piece and in general, like we try to divert away from this critique of, oh, let's pick out the nonprofits where bad people are doing bad things, right? That's like a common critique. And that stuff is really important in one sense, right? Like looking at like Bill Gates' healthcare work in like India and Africa, for instance. Like it's like pretty insidious when you look into it. And I think I mean, there's lots of examples of that. But what we want to say is that that's kind of an iteration of like the bad apple critique, right? Like saying, oh, once we get rid of those few bad apples, then the nonprofit sector as a whole is fine. And it's the structural critique that we think is like central to the left's position, not the bad apple critique.
Yeah, I mean, let me read a little bit from the piece on this. I think really highlights it. Y'all right. Our argument is not that all third sector agencies are thinly veiled vehicles for the political machinations of particular elites, though they can be that as well. Rather, NGOs are structurally reliant on funding in a way that leaves them ultimately under the undue influence of capitalist interests, which limits ahead of time what they typically pursue and advocate for. NGOs are generally assumed to be synonymous with 501c3s, but it is funding structures, not tax status, that determine the restraints of generative NGOism. And like, I think that this, gets to, the heart of the problem here. It's not that everybody who works in that world is bad. It's not that everyone is getting a phone call from a rich guy saying, let's trick the working class into funding our activities and demobilize social movements. It's that by in order for them to survive, they have to placate particular interests. And it sort of limits their ability to engage in politics. And you see this, for example, on the larger like political sphere, when like something bad happens, political, like abortion, for example, like the first reaction is like, let's try to fundraise a bunch of money on this. Not necessarily saying that funding some of these services is necessarily bad. I mean, we certainly raised money for abortion funds here in Texas once they took that right away. But it's recognizing that there's a kind of politicization too that comes into this from like the general public. I think when they're trying to engage in certain political crises. I mean, we've touched about it. Y'all been talking about it a little bit, but like I think it's worth like highlighting again the difference between y'all's criticism and like this kind of old school criticism of NGOs. I mean, I know when I first became like a leftist, reading Alexander Cockburn. And him basically making the NGO industrial complex argument, feeling like, oh, that's great. But I think that that's a limited perspective, as y'all were saying, because, you can just sort of say, well, if we just fix the nonprofit world, then we'll be golden.
Right. Yeah. And I think it really comes down to the fact that ultimately these are not vehicles designed to redistribute wealth. Mm-hmm. What they are really designed to do is to take up the slack of the state in administering social welfare. And then I don't know that they were necessarily intentionally designed this way, but in effect, what they then are allowed to do is they provide another vehicle for elites to pick and choose what kind of social welfare they want to fund. Mm-hmm. Because basically you're allowing rich individuals, corporations, and foundations, which themselves are mostly accumulated pools of individual wealthy people, to say like, I want to put my money towards this, and this cause. And these other causes, I'm not going to bother to fund them. And the problem is that, in effect, like if the state was running these sorts of things and there wasn't this phenomenon of just like massive wealthy philanthropy, the state would be collecting tax dollars, and in theory, it would be a democratic process as to what social institutions are funded. So it just takes away the ability of the public to actually decide what social problems we're going to tackle. And it also takes away the ability of the public to decide how we're going to tackle social problems, because ultimately these are private institutions. They're only so responsive to the government in the sense that they just need to do whatever they need to do to get the next grant. They're not publicly run and accountable institutions. So they really insulate the state and the people's ability to dictate how we are going to deal with social problems.
Yeah, I mean, well, actually, I don't know if you all saw the map of like 2020 primary support, like, and like a lot of it was like Bernie Sanders, a lot of it was Biden and whatnot. And in DC, there was, little Buttigieg corner, like little Klobuchar corner, and there's no Bernie support, right? And I think someone like looks at that and says, oh, like DC is fundamentally like more moderate than like the rest of the country or something like that. I mean, I think from like a material perspective, like, these are people who are self-interested. They're interested in like keeping their job and the sort of like liberal government nonprofit world. And they knew that if Sanders came to DC, that like they would probably lose their jobs, or at least that like that those professional networks would not be intact in the way that they were. So it's a very sort of like material insulation that you can see. I just wanted to add one caveat to what Melissa said. I mean, I think that for the most part, what nonprofit advocacy and service work looks like is sort of depoliticized solutions, right? I think for the most part, that's what it looks like. And it's like, it's a moral response to a political problem, right? All that applies. I do, however, think that there is a political element that that nonprofit work has been and is increasingly politicized, but in a way that sort of diverts attention away from class politics. So really, our story really picks up in the article when the Ford Foundation makes a very conscious effort to get involved with civil rights issues, and the way in which they do so leads people to believe that they have chosen a side, and that in turn spawns all of these like conservative foundations, right? And so you have this whole foundation world that is itself politicized, and increasingly so, right? Like as as our political situation degrades in the United States, these foundations, which have more money than ever, are becoming more activist in orientation, right? They are reimagining their funding strategies. They're seeing that they can't just stay on the sidelines. They feel compelled by a moral urge to do something, to fund different kinds of organizations than they've funded in the past. And this means that they're going to be more and more politically involved, but in such a way that undergirds the partisan divide rather than contributing to a class politics. So I think for the most part, as Melissa said, it's nonprofit, moral work, which is one problem, politically. But increasingly, like the way in which they're contributing is to undergird the existing political divide.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely for the last few minutes I want to focus on community, because I think y'all are two good folks for that. But before we get there, like one of the other tenets of NGOism is technocracy, and so I went to college in DC, and I graduated just right before the Bernie moment. I was like a secret. I was like secret socialist when I didn't think there was going to be any kind of socialist movement, and I knew that nonprofit world very well, and I found the way that y'all described the kind of technocratic, but particularly like the neutral expert aspect of NGOism to be interesting. I mean, is there anything that y'all want to add to that understanding for our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, this was again a sort of like product of the 60s. I think that a lot of elite actors decided that the existing political spaces were counterproductive. They were seeing like what was happening with the New Left, and they were like, we need to have a more productive and more what they thought of as efficient sort of like political space. And so, there was a very self-conscious sort of creation of deliberative mechanisms where you could bring together community participants in a structured dialogue so as to produce consensus. And, and then you could take the outcomes of these meetings and give them to city council members to pass certain things. So there's a real investment in creating decision-making processes that were not essentially democratic, that were not really deliberative, and to exclude any kind of like contention from the process of deciding policy. And, I mean, contention is what politics is about. I mean, that's what produces good things for the working class. And if you remove that, then, you have everyone sort of nodding along to an elite-driven agenda.
Yeah, and I think the other component of that as well is when you remove from the table that these problems are being caused by the unequal distribution of wealth and exploitation, you kind of have to fish about for what could possibly be the reason why there is so much and such extreme suffering in a society that you're arguing is like fundamentally just and okay and just needs to be tinkered with. And so then you have, on the one hand, this is something Alice O'Connor talks about, who's a great scholar on these kinds of issues, and in particular what happened in the 60s with the Ford Foundation. You start to have these obsessions with exactly defining, in an empirical way, essentially, like what suffering is, what poverty is. And so then it creates this whole industry, essentially, of number crunching and tinkering with, with standards and protocols and things, just to be able to, precisely quantify or move a decimal as to like what suffering is in capitalism. But then on the other hand, it's like you have to cast about for these strange solutions that, like, to any materialist are just obviously not going to fix the root of the issue. And so we talk about like one of these kinds of programs in our article called TNTP. It used to be called the New Teacher Project, of what to do with the school district in Camden, which is in severe crisis. And they're in severe crisis because they're millions of dollars in a budget deficit. And when you can't properly fund a school district, you're not going to provide like a quality environment for education. And so, like, they bring in this nonprofit to be like, how can we fix the school system? Of course, budget is off the table. Here's X number of dollars that of course have been put back into the school, but whatever, to come up with some solution. And the solutions they come up with are like leadership training programs and like and the reason that like people aren't becoming leaders in the school is because it's a really difficult place to work with, because the school's not funded. So it's like, you have all of this expertise to avoid dealing with the actual social issue that's causing all of these problems.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's just like it's funny. Like here in Texas, obviously, with the right-wing government being in power for so long, there's this big push for charter schools. But like as an example of like how detached, even like on the right wing, like the NGO world is from like the actual like reality of people. Every time they try to push charter schools here, even in like very red districts, people get really pissed, because particularly in rural parts of Texas, like the high school is a big deal socially and culturally, right? It's like that's where you go on Friday, watch the football games, and they're getting like pushed back against. And I don't know. I just find it like an interesting example of like how even these kind of experts are far from the reality of even people who they might think are already in their coalition. But I want to make sure that we get time to jump into this, because I think this is an important bit. One of the tenets of NGOism is this fixation on community, and community is a very, very loose term. You see it a lot in the NGOs. You'll see it a lot in left political circles too. I mean, I'd like to hear what y'all think about how this like term of community can be depoliticizing and inaccurate. I'm thinking of one particular example that might help highlight this for folks. Like in the environmental movement, there's this big push on, for example, frontline communities. And Matt Huber's written in Catalyst about this, and also in his book, Climate Change is Class War. That like this is like a pure creation of the NGO world. When you go to these frontline communities, people don't necessarily consider themselves to be in these communities or actually on the front lines of climate change. And what it actually means, like policy wise, is that they're trying to do what y'all were talking about a second ago, come up with like the perfect algorithm that finds like what community is the most affected, what community is the worst off from a collective social problem that is climate change. But could y'all talk a little bit about like this fixation on community in the NGO space, and if y'all wanted to maybe on the left more broadly, I'd love to hear it.
I guess the first thing that should be said is that not everyone who utters the word community has sold out or something, right? That's not the critique. It's an unavoidable term to use, right? Like it just comes up in everyday speech. So it's not that it's always an indication of like this intent or something. But yeah, I think the first thing to notice about the word community is just how amorphous it is. Something like class, I guess we could get into like how exactly you define class. We can have a very academic debate about it, but at the end of the day, they're like, there's some pretty clear designations as to how we might envision that. With community, it really depends a lot on who's defining what the community is, right? This could be a community bounded by a certain geographic space. It could be a community defined along different identity characteristics, like what the community is really subject to who's talking about it. And that's I think actually what makes it so useful to these elite actors, that they can define what a community is ahead of time, and in such a way that they can designate who the community representatives are going to be, right? And that's a really key process in for instance, like community development corporations, where these are sort of like local organizations that have essentially become like aids to private development, where you bring in different community representatives chosen ahead of time to speak for particular constituencies, even if they might not be elected or even sort of part of different membership organizations. So I think it's the amorphousness that we were really focused on, and how community can be and typically is used in such a way as to back elite-driven projects, and it's used in such a way as to distract from and kind of confuse class politics.
Yeah, and this is another place where it's helpful to look back at the 60s, because in the 60s they were actively debating this question of how you construct a community. And sort of the big question was, should we consider a community a homogeneous concept or a heterogeneous one, in the sense that, is a community a group of people who are all defined by a core common trait? Or actually is a community a collection of individuals who have some sort of vague common interest, in the sense that they want their community to succeed? I mean, it's very tautological, but this is the debate. And actually, like, what the community is bringing all these different people together to kind of like to come up with, like, their real expression of interest. And today there's just not even like a serious discussion about like how we define it. It's often just conjured up as a way to just indicate, like, here's a group of people, here's someone representing them. And that's kind of where it stops. You basically evacuate the entire content of what constituency you're talking about when this word is used. And I think, like Ben said, that's not to say that it's like an evil word. I mean, I catch myself using it like all the time.
Of course.
You can't not use it, but it's also an incredibly ideological word, because it allows you to just put whatever meaning you want into it. And in terms of the left, I think what you see all the time is, frankly, like, you talk about a need, and then you go out and you find a community, and then you say, like, these are the people who have the need that we want to work on. And, sometimes there's even more sort of like confused rhetoric about how we have to go out into the community and tell the people that they need this thing that actually we've already decided that they need, but we need to go hear it from them that they need it. And so it's this very confused process of, are we in the community? Are we not in the community? It's like, I mean, it's totally confusing when you're in these conversations, like, and I think it kind of connects back also to some of the other concepts we talked about this distinction of doing for or doing to, that the left often talks about itself in a way that separates it from the sort of like objects of its political action, and counterposes itself as one community going to another community, which is just not historically what the left has been about at all. The left, really, like, in its prime, was about bringing people together who shared a common interest to work towards a common goal. It wasn't about this much more philanthropic approach to politics, where you're identifying needs for others and doing for them. This concept of going into communities that you don't identify with.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would just say to listeners of this program, I think a way to think about this might be how we always make the distinction between class-rooted and class-focused politics. I think this is like a pretty good example of that. But last question, I really appreciate y'all's time here, but this is a big one, but I think it's an important one. So, like, people are hearing this, they're hearing the criticisms of the NGO structure, but sitting here today, 2022, I mean, I think we can all sort of be clear, Bernie adjacent DSA kind of politics is who we care about talking about, really. We're talking about the left. But, you know, the NGO world's there. A lot of people are, you know, might be working in it, might be affiliated with it. They've absorbed a lot of the arguments, understandings of the world from it. Y'all lay out a pretty strong critique. But what should our posture be? And, you know, to complicate it a little bit, I mean, in this moment right now, where there are service-based organizations of a large variety, particularly when it comes to, you know, healthcare and abortion rights, you know, I think people who watched this show and read things in Jacobin recognize, for example, that there was a huge loss in the fight for women's healthcare in this country by like the leadership of a lot of NGOs, because they weren't really willing to have these kind of fights. I think that also led to a lot of like the overfixation on the legal strategy over the political strategy on these things. But again, like we're in a crisis moment right now. You know, there are organizations that are trying to, in different capacities, different organizations are doing different things, trying to fight back against, you know, some of these laws, particularly in places like in Texas or in Alabama. I mean, what should our stance be, you know, to NGOs? I mean, how can we sort of take this critique into our politics?
I think it's really simple. Anytime anyone invites you to a training, just politely decline and slowly back away. So, no thanks. I would not like to be trained today. No, I mean, I think of the role of, so there's the broader structural issues of like the third sector, and then there's the influence of NGOism as a particular strategic orientation to solving social ills. And I think on the latter front, you know, I think the primary problem that causes, like much like academia, is just confusion about you know, a basic sort of political strategy that makes sense for the left to pursue. I think the key thing is getting people into unions and electing left candidates. Yeah. Right? Those two things are the key things. If nonprofits, if other kinds of sort of third sector entities want to contribute to that with no strings attached, and they are not the leaders of the projects, but they are that they want to support that stuff, great. I think that they've become very adept at adding strings to any kind of funding or support that they offer. And so you should be wary of it. But, you know, I think it's time to be clear-eyed, right? Like all of the stuff that, all of the different projects that they're interested in, so that they can like produce nice glossy reports to their funders about how they're doing X, Y, or Z. All that stuff needs to be, it's their business. And for the left, it should be clear-eyed about our tasks and not be confused by the various sort of coalition partners who we might want to entertain.
Yeah, and I think the difficult thing is that, like, the point of our analysis is to say that not everything NGOs do is evil. Actually, a lot of things they do are socially good in a sense, and it's not that we're against them. It's the fact that they don't have political strategies necessary to actually tackle the root of the social problems that they are basically putting a Band-Aid on. And I think for, you know, these sorts of political fights where really they are in the power seat, they are the ones driving things forward, it doesn't necessarily mean we're against them. And in fact, we're often for them. And obviously abortion is one example, but there's tons of historical examples that, you know, a lot of people point to. I mean, the big one being civil rights. I mean, like, foundations were very important in funding a lot of civil rights initiatives, in particular voter registration in the South. There's nothing that's bad about that. Like, it's like, we support that, you know? The problem is they're only going to go so far. And so to leave them in control of these issues is a huge long-term problem, because they're not capable of tackling the actual underlying issues. So, you know, it's kind of like, in the short term, you know, be careful, which isn't very satisfying. I think the most unsatisfying thing is that they have more power than the left does right now. They have much more agenda setting control. And the only way around that is to organize and build up build up the left's membership, build up the left's political power and political significance, so that we do have agenda setting power. You know, and I think there's other questions in the long term about, you know, what the proper role for these kinds of institutions are.
Well, Ben and Melissa, I really appreciate y'all joining us on Left Reckoning. To listeners, when you see Ben or Melissa publish somewhere, you should definitely read it. These are the kind of thinkers you should be engaging with. We'll have a link in the show notes to y'all's piece. But again, really appreciate y'all so much.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Well, everyone, that was a lot of fun. I can't suggest Ben and Melissa's work enough. I think that was an interesting conversation. I know people have a lot of opinions about it, so looking forward to hearing from everybody.
Yeah. I was ashamed to hear you debunk the idea that NGOs have a phone call placed to everybody who becomes an employee that says, this is how we're going to fool the middle class. That'd be a great document to have.
That's a whole other conversation, but I think that that's such a bad habit on the left, man. There are lots of conspiracies and things that do happen like that, but we cannot fall into the trap of being conspiratorial. We have really good analytical tools to understand why structurally these things do what they do, which is different from them. Oh, they've been corrupted. And can I just say one thing just to make it absolutely clear? Because I think some people might get the wrong impression from that conversation. I want to say that people who work in NGOs are bad. Hell, I've done work with NGOs. It's recognizing that they have a large role in left politics for a reason. And rather than just being something, we're going to fix it with the right NGOs, understanding that the structural impediments to that kind of avenue for social change, create a situation where basically, no, we have to return power to working class people. And the fact is that the system has been set up to be a kind of intermediary on important issues that affect a lot of people's lives, with an effect that people do get depoliticized, with the effect that some of these social struggles do become being sort of moderated or managed, instead of what we want is people being able to have the opportunity to fight for a better life. So anyways, it's not an attack on NGO workers or anything like that. It's just recognizing to all the folks who've been dedicating their lives to this fight that what we really have to be doing is reorienting our politics, and this can take a lot of work. There's not an easy roadmap, but I think, as Ben said, it's what we got to do is we got to be winning some political power and getting a stronger labor movement. And it's simple, but that's the game in front of us. But yeah, y'all, appreciate everyone so much. We're going to jump right over to the post game. So you get access to that patreon.com/left reckoning. Just will say one last thing in case some people did join us up a little bit late. We're doing a contest for folks who might be interested in making us some promotional material for our Los Angeles show, October 23rd at the Telegram Ballroom. And the winner from Left Reckoning will get a Left Reckoning merch item of their choice. So send those to leftreckoning@gmail.com. And we'll see you all over there in the postgame in just a little bit.
See you, folks.